Professor Bill Fleming, Associate Professor, Community and Regional Planning, University of New Mexico. Bill is our expert in water resource management, our environmental planner, loved by colleagues and by students. Bill, I know you come into the position, or you hold the position, with a very well-articulated philosophy of environmental planning. What is environmental planning from your point of view?
My concern with environmental planning is human interaction with the natural environment. And by that I mean, how are humans affecting the land? And by land I mean all of that ecosystem, the soils, the vegetation, the air, the water, all those things that we are totally dependent upon for our survival. And I think these things could be articulated with one word that has many definitions, the word sustainability, which could be summarized by the use of our resources now so that our future generations, and I mean in the very long term, hundreds, thousands of years, hopefully, that they will have enough to sustain them in the same way that we have those resources today.
So I know one of the things that you are an expert in is our watersheds. And so you look at the relationship between what goes on above ground and how it affects what goes on underground with our water tables.
Yes, and I might enlarge that definition somewhat to the term watersheds, which includes the total holistic environmental framework that we think of as our life support system. That is the water that falls on a particular landscape, that nurtures the vegetation, that becomes stream flow, that we are totally dependent on for irrigation, for agriculture, and for human use, and the support system that water gives to vegetation on that environment. Because if the vegetation and the ecosystem that is associated with that is not healthy, then we are not healthy.
So things like erosion have an impact on the watersheds?
Yes, they certainly do. And I might just mention as an example a grant from the New Mexico Game and Fish Department enabled me and some of my graduate students to develop a program called New Mexico Watershed Watch that is a program to monitor watershed health from not only a water quality point of view, but also a holistic watershed point of view, and looks at the development issues on our landscape, for everything from farming, grazing, forestry, urban landscapes, and what impacts that has. And we have worked with 15 to 20 high schools, middle schools in the state to monitor these resources on a yearly basis.
And then what do you do with that data?
This data goes to the New Mexico Environment Division, it goes to the Game and Fish Department, it's used by various databases in our schools.
So people have access to it, the public have access to it?
The public has access to that through a lot of different avenues.
Fantastic. So, you know, in New Mexico, we've got some very, very important and some big watersheds, right? So when we pay attention to the environmental issues, it becomes very important that we're protecting the overall holistic health of these watersheds.
Well, some of our watersheds, in fact, are larger than the state of New Mexico. The Rio Grande watershed starts in the headwaters of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, flows through New Mexico, is the largest watershed we have in New Mexico, then flows into Mexico and Texas, and is a major ecosystem that we've depended upon for thousands of years.
So it's a whole other perspective to think about these worlds underneath the ground, right? A lot of times we think we have political jurisdictions and we have these, these sort of created boundaries, man-created and women-created boundaries, and yet there's all these other boundaries that transcend or go beyond any kind of political jurisdictions that really require regional solutions, I would think, to how we approach some of these issues.
Well, that's absolutely true. We can't simply look at one small community or one small catchment or watershed. We have to look at the larger issues of regional planning to look at these aspects.
And transborder even.
And, of course, transborder issues, yes.
Now, I know that you and Professor Henkel have worked on a rapid appraisal technique to be able to assess very quickly the conditions of some of these watersheds, or the land, I guess, above some of these sheds. So tell us a little bit about that technique and how you've applied it.
Well, we've come up with several methods to evaluate the health of both watersheds and particularly riparian systems. That is, the border around these waterscapes that we have in New Mexico. In fact, they're a very small portion of our landscape in New Mexico. 2 to 3% of our land could be considered riparian zones.
The Bosque, would that be a riparian zone?
The Bosque in Albuquerque would be a riparian zone, that's right. But that zone supports probably 90% of our wildlife, 90% of our plant resources, and is a very, very significant part of our landscape. And Professor Henkel and I have developed methods to evaluate the health of the riparian area, that is in terms of vegetation and wildlife diversity, in terms of water quality, in terms of water pollution issues such as sediment in the river, nutrients in the river, and as well the health of the organisms that live in the river. I might just mention aquatic insects as one of the indicators of a healthy stream system. If a stream has, for example, mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies, rather than larvae of different kinds of worms, it's a much healthier stream, and it's a good indicator for long-term watershed health. So
how we treat then the riparian systems, the areas along our riverways, is very important.
It is. It's critical. It's critical.
And so once you've done this assessment, then have you, I'm sure some of your work also includes talking about what are some ways that you can mitigate some of these impacts, or ways you can actually preserve these riparian zones.
Well, I think that gets into some of the research projects that we have done over the course of the time that I've been teaching here at UNM over the last 20 years or so. And many of our students have chosen professional projects or theses that have to do with evaluating landscapes in our watersheds and to determine land use suitability for those different landscapes. In other words, what type of a development or community activity is appropriate and suitable for that particular landscape, which activities would not be suitable, where roads should go, where roads should not go, which landscapes have other values such as wildlife and water quality values, environmental ecosystem services is the term that is used a lot nowadays for that.
So that's fantastic. So then the idea is you then get that into the hands of the policymakers to help ensure that these areas actually are developed in a way that's suitable to the protection of that system. Well, that's the idea anyway, right?
The hope is that these recommendations that come out of both our faculty research and our student research in the form of master's level projects would be adopted by agencies, both city agencies, rural agencies, county agencies, and in particular our water planning agencies such as the Interstate Stream Commission.
And a lot of times it's a combination of those agencies that really have jurisdiction over a given area too. Sometimes it requires their partnership among the agencies.
There are many overlapping jurisdictions in New Mexico, and so it involves work with state-level agencies as well as local agencies, federal agencies, and if these agencies don't work together on our very quite different jurisdictions in New Mexico, then we don't accomplish what we need to.
So in order to protect our lovely bosque along the Rio Grande, let's say even just here in the metropolitan area, I often myself take walks through there and enjoy the bosque. In order to really protect that, what do you think would be some of the things that these different agencies would need to do to make sure that we not only improve the quality of that riparian system, but protect it in the long range? What are some of those things that we need to make sure could happen or don't happen?
Well, if I could tell a short story that has some historical significance that has to do with the bosque and what is now known as Rio Grande Park. And so we have a landscape on both sides of the Rio Grande that extends for nearly 40 miles. That was the idea of one of my conservation heroes, Aldo Leopold, in the 1920s, who suggested that the city of Albuquerque first hire a city planner. They didn't do that then, but later that happened. But he was the original idea man to create the Rio Grande Park that we have and the bosque landscape that we have now. And in order to, that is a reserved landscape in New Mexico, which reserves a certain buffer zone on both sides of the Rio Grande with the cottonwood trees, the willows, the wildlife, and very important recreational amenities for the city of Albuquerque. And so I think our Bernalillo open space program and other of our county and city programs, in addition to the pueblos up and down the Rio Grande, are doing a good job of reserving that landscape and making sure that we have cottonwoods and willows and a healthy riparian system in the long term.
Great, great. So it's in all of our interest then that we protect that bosque and what goes on there.
I think it's very much in our interest to preserve a water landscape, what my colleague Jose Rivera sometimes refers to as paisaje del agua, that landscape between the acequia systems on both sides of the river and the river, which enlarges that greenscape, that green space for all of us.
Now you mentioned Aldo Leopold. I know that he's one of your favorites. Tell us a little bit more about Aldo Leopold and maybe some of your other favorite environmentalists.
Well, Aldo Leopold's famous book, Sand County Almanac.
Which you gave me a copy. You gave me a copy of that. I treasure that.
Which I did. I gave you a copy, as I give all of my colleagues copies of that. And it's a book that describes in its essence a land ethic that is a statement of how we need to treat our landscape so that we have a healthy landscape in the very long term. And it's not just a scientific treatise, although he was a very competent wildlife biologist and forester. It's also an ethical exposition of how we might look at our long-term future with the land and treat it with respect. He said several things that are quite quotable. One is that a thing is right if it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It's wrong if it does otherwise. And that's a pretty good philosophy for planners, community and regional planners to follow when they look at whether certain ways of developing a landscape are appropriate or not.
And Ian, is it?
Ian McHarg is another person who contributed a lot to the whole field of environmental planning. He published a book in the late 70s called Design with Nature. And this book is one that I discovered in my graduate work at the University of British Columbia when he came to give a talk on the technique of land use suitability. That is using overlay analysis maps to look at first the geology, then the soils, then the vegetation, then the water, then all of the organisms that live on that landscape, and the cultural and human additions to that landscape that we've done in order to determine what types of development, what types of preservation, what types of conservation is appropriate for that landscape.
Now, you mentioned your colleague Jose Rivera. I know that the two of you have received National Science Foundation grant money to do some work on the impacts of global climate change on acequia systems and on some of these other issues related to the environmental health of our region. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that project.
Sure. This was a National Science Foundation proposal that we submitted 4 years ago. And the purpose of this was to investigate and to evaluate what the impacts of future climate change, which we could, I think, rightly say that we're experiencing right now, but we will be experiencing it in a much more severe way in the future. What impacts climate change has on northern New Mexico acequia systems. And so we received several $100,000 to fund graduate level research on the cultural, environmental, hydrological, and long-term impacts on northern New Mexico acequias. So we are now, we have had several graduate students do their professional projects and theses on work in two areas in particular in northern New Mexico, the Rio Hondo, north of Taos, and El Rito, which is on the west side of the Rio Grande. And those two stream systems have roughly 30 different acequia associations that are totally dependent on the water supply from those two watersheds.
That's fantastic. So those students not only got paid assistantships to work on the project, but then they were able to use their work on that project to develop their own professional projects and thus receive their graduate degrees.
That's quite true. And Jose and I are taking that work to another level, and we're working with several of our graduate students to publish papers on the ecosystem services of this concept of paisaje del agua that acequia systems generate in our watersheds.
Well, what's great about your great knowledge and experience in the field of environmental planning and natural resource planning and policy, natural resource management, is these are things that you bring to the classroom. So your watershed management class is always a very popular and useful class, especially for those students who are doing a joint degree with water resource management. What do you cover in that class?
Well, I developed this course called Watershed Management about 20 years ago. I was asked to do this. In fact, Rick Richardson was the person who asked me to develop a course and teach a course in watershed management. And it's a holistic look at a piece of landscape defined as a watershed or a catchment in which we have all kinds of development issues from grazing, forestry in the uplands, grazing in the middle parts of watersheds, and in general, communities who live in the lower elevations of these watersheds. So in order to deal with impacts of human development on watersheds, we need to look at the entire watershed from the top of where the water accumulates, through the watershed where the water is either infiltrated and used by vegetation or recharges groundwater aquifers and then comes downstream in the form of surface flow to support our extensive agricultural use and development use in terms of industrial and municipal use in the lower parts of our watershed. And so the final paper for each student in my watershed classes is to take a watershed and to analyze, first do an inventory of the resources in that watershed, secondly to critically analyze one or two major issues of management within that watershed, both spatially and developmentally, and then to write a section on restoration and preservation for that
So
resource.
Always the solution. We always go to using our planning processes and techniques to identify and understand the issues, but always we move towards figuring out solutions.
We need to figure out solutions, right. And I might just emphasize that first we need an inventory of what's there. We need to know what the resources are, then to identify the problems, and the third step is to come up with solutions.
Now you also have a field methods class. So people don't just do this from the classroom. You get students out there in all of your classes. They're in the field. And if they're lucky, they can keep up with you.
Well, I think it's critical that students not just get this information theoretically in a classroom, but go out in the field and to see these things on the ground. And so I have been concerned, particularly in the last several years, in developing field courses where we go out and evaluate these things, measure these things, find out what the diversity of plants, animals, and uses of that landscape are, and then to evaluate things like riparian health, water quality, and to get a sense for what is the difference between urban issues here in Albuquerque and issues in, for example, our highest elevation watershed in New Mexico, the Rio Hondo, which is where we go for one of our weekend field trips.
Fantastic. Now, you also teach our foundations of natural resources, or natural resource planning. What do you cover in that course?
Well,
much of the same, I suspect.
Well, foundations of natural resources is not the field class, but although I do have several field trips that are involved in that class. But Foundations of Natural Resources is a course where we look at not only what problems we have in terms of environmental issues, water quality issues, groundwater contamination issues, issues of grazing, soil erosion, issues of how to, again, deal with sustainability. We spend a lot of time defining the term sustainability, what it means to different practitioners in the field. And so we then use the inventory technique I mentioned earlier, developed by Ian McHarg, in terms of evaluating land use suitability for different uses.
Fantastic. Now, we also have an undergraduate program, and one of the required courses for that program, which also meets a UNM core, is our Introduction to Environmental Planning, CRP 181. This is a very, very popular class, and it's very important to us that our BA/PD students take this class. So when students take that class, what do they learn?
Well, I enjoy that course a lot, and you mentioned the program BA/EPD, the Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Planning and Design, and it's a program that I helped develop some 10 years ago, and we've been involved in revising that program extensively
it's
since.
It's really flourished under your direction, and now with Professor Gonzalez, it's a great degree.
Yeah, it now has almost 60 students in it, and it's a survey of environmental issues with the focus on New Mexico. However,
the 181 is.
This is our undergraduate course, CRP 181, and I might also mention that I teach it with a case study method. So I illustrate each of the principles of environmental problems and planning issues with a case study where I have worked in the past. I've done extensive work in this state, but I also have an interest in environmental development issues, and had an earlier career with the United Nations working in Latin America and Asia. And so I bring those case studies, and particularly watershed planning issues that I worked on for several years before coming to New Mexico some 30 years ago, and bring those into the classroom to illustrate environmental issues.
You know, you mentioned your UN experience and some of your work in Latin America and in Asia. And one of the the great items in your portfolio is your work in Nepal, which is a great example of a longitudinal study. I mean, you've examined that at different time periods, their watershed health and what impacts their watershed health, and you even have now a student who's winning an award to go and continue some of that research. So, tell us about your Nepal work, and you can even throw in some of your Latin American work and how it was tied into UN work.
Well, before I came to New Mexico, my wife and I lived in Nepal for several years, also in Ecuador for several years. And in particular, the work in Nepal started with a watershed plan for a very high priority watershed in Nepal. It's a place where there has a huge tourism potential, and it's one of the places where most foreigners who go to Nepal go on for trekking, and it includes part of the Annapurna Sanctuary. So this is a watershed that I analyzed and wrote a conservation plan for some 30 years ago when I was working for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN. So this plan was then implemented in various ways over the past 30 years, and I've been back quite a few times to reevaluate how that watershed was doing. And in particular, 5 years ago on my sabbatical year, my wife and I spent most of a year in Nepal reevaluating what lessons were learned with this watershed conservation plan. What worked, what didn't work, and then published papers on what happened. And it turned out that a program called community forestry, which involved local people in managing their own forest and grazing lands for the resources that come from those two landscapes, was much more important than some of the engineering solutions such as check dams and river structures in the success of these projects. And it turned out that there were some over 90 community forestry groups that were organized in this watershed over time, and the economic benefits were quite substantial in terms of increasing the forest and grazing pasture landscapes resources.
Fantastic. So that has some broad implications for beyond Nepal. I mean, it points to the importance of local knowledge, for example. It points to the importance of community-based approaches even to natural resource management. You see some of those ideas, their value in being applied elsewhere?
Well, I think the whole concept of community-based planning and what I mean by that is bottom-up planning. That is local people deciding what their problems are, and then other practitioners such as myself coming in to help with organizing those plans. But the basis for those are community-based or bottom-up planning rather than top-down sorts of planning. I think those lessons are extremely important for us to incorporate into our careers.
So now, after students have studied with you, and there are many who have and many who produce wonderful professional projects and theses and go on to become professionals both in the state and even nationally and even some internationally, students come out of there with a sense of connection of themselves in relationship to the natural world. Yes.
Well, I would hope so. Which is one reason that I emphasize field work and field courses, so that students go out into a landscape and actually measure things. They do transects to look at vegetation diversity, to look at erosion rates on different types of landscapes and different slopes, different soil structures, and different rainfall patterns. They actually get their hands wet, they get into streams, they collect insects, and I think this creates a much more immediate connection with the landscape.
And where are your students working? Where are some of your students employed?
Well,
too many to name, I'm sure. But
one of my students has started his own environmental education consulting firm in Santa Fe, and he works with high schools and middle schools to carry on the work that I started with the New Mexico Watershed Watch program.
Oh, fantastic.
Other students are working with international organizations in Latin America, working with community forestry groups there. Other students are working with open space programs. I think we have 5 students working with Santa Fe County on land use issues and open space. Several students are working for the New Mexico Water Resources Agency, the State Engineer Office, or the Interstate Stream Commission on issues of water management, issues of water rights analysis. Some are working with, we have one student who's the director of the New Mexico Seiki Association. And so we have a lot of students out there working on issues that I think are extremely important.
Fantastic. And you are one of the jewels of the Community Regional Planning Program. Professor William Fleming, Community Regional Planning Program, the University of New Mexico. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you.